In continuing our Celtic Myth series, let's do a big one that Scotland is most famous for. One that you have all definitely heard of, and one that for some reason still generates a lot of tourism in Scotland. The Loch Ness Monster. And before we get into the video, we have a new sponsor. Today's video is brought to you by Galaxy Lamps. Explore the galaxy from the comfort of your home and fill your rooms with immersive, ambient and energy efficient RGB lighting. I find it pretty reliable and $60 off when you spend $200. So take advantage of it and get a great product while saving some money. So please go to galaxylamps.co/CountDankula or click the link in the description box down below to get your own space lamp. New sponsor. Show them some love. Click the link. Finally, we come to a mythological creature that many of you will know of. Nessie, who is commonly known as the Loch Ness Monster because it is a monster that lives in Loch Ness. Despite popularity and the widespread knowledge of Nessie and the Loch, Nessie is a different kind of Celtic myth in that Nessie doesn't appear in any of the Celtic religious scripture. Nessie also doesn't grant wishes, curse people, or cause the destruction of small local communities. Nessie is a large amphibious or biamphibious but mostly aquatic cryptid apparently living in Loch Ness for a very long time. In the beginning, Nessie was thought to attack people entering the loch since the loch was its territory. But only the earliest sightings ever mention Nessie actually being aggressive. And since then, there have been many sightings and hoaxes, which we will soon cover. Loch Ness is located in the Highland Boundary Fault Line, or what a lot of local people like to call the Crack, which runs all the way across Scotland, almost splitting it in half. You know, it's like an OnlyFans model, an absolutely giant crevice that is absolutely teeming with wildlife. Loch Ness itself, however, is around 23 miles long, 1 mile wide, and has a huge depth of 226 metres or 744 feet. There is more water in Loch Ness than all of the freshwater lakes and rivers of England and Wales combined. This will give you an idea of why it is so difficult to track a single creature in the loch, despite its supposed massive size. Even with the vastness of the water, someone should have found some legitimate evidence by now. Nessie does, however, have some die-hard and even crazy believers that have and will spend their entire lives searching the waters for the answer to its existence. Some of them just want the myth to be real, and others chase the fame of being the first one to find or catch Nessie. Because of the myth of Nessie spreading, there have been many shows and movies about the creature, all of them being absolutely shite. Usually over-dramatised and made by Americans or other non-Scottish sources. From a folklore aspect, Nessie fits in perfectly with a lot of mythological creatures, especially since Nessie dwells in water, which, as we have explained before, in the Celtic pagan religion, bodies of water are considered portals to the other world that monsters can pass through, which is why so many Scottish cryptids are associated with water. Others believe that Nessie is a myth with a more modern compatibility when compared to some of the older water-based mythical creatures such as the Kelpie, since Nessie isn't actually magic. Doesn't have any magical powers at all, like a lot of the other Celtic monsters. Which is why this story is just believable enough even for people that don't accept mythology. Some people think that Nessie may just be the last remaining dinosaur. Nessie has also been used in the same way as other mythical creatures always have been, to keep the vulnerable safe. A child is much less likely to play near the very deep waters of the loch after hearing that a monster is lurking in there that will eat them. That on top of the wild imagination of youth, and you can be sure that they will steer clear of the water and therefore steer clear of drowning. But now, let's get on to some of the many alleged sightings and hoaxes of the Loch Ness Monster. A lot of people think that Nessie is a sort of semi-recent invention, like 1700s, 1800s, but the earliest alleged sighting of Nessie was actually in the year 565, when the Irish monk St. Columba was staying in Pictland. And in case you need an explanation, Pictland is the land of the Picts, who are our ancestors. The name Pict was given to us by the Romans, and it meant the painted ones, since whenever we went into battle, our bodies would be painted in blue wood, allegedly to show that that was all the armour they needed and they were not afraid of dying, which, if you read a lot of the old Roman texts, turned out that was actually a pretty effective scare tactic. One that worked so well that the Romans just decided to go, nah, and build a giant wall. We were one of the few places that the Romans couldn't conquer. Well, that's not surprising, they were a bunch of bisexual Italians. However, just to point out as well, the Picts used blue wood. The Picts. William Wallace and his armies, who came many, many years later, did not. They did not have the blue face paint, unfortunately. That was just a historical inaccuracy that was perpetuated by the movie Braveheart, which is a great movie, right? I love Braveheart. It's an excellent movie. It makes me feel patriotic as fuck. However, Jesus Christ, it's so historically inaccurate. But anyway, let's not go on a tangent. St. Columba came across some locals who were burying a man by the waterside of the River Ness, which is the river that runs into the loch. The locals explained that the man had been swimming in the river when he was suddenly attacked by a mysterious beast in the water. Columba then sent one of his followers to swim across the river to see if the beast would reveal itself. And it did, and it started swimming towards the man. Now, here's where the story becomes, pretty much religious propaganda. Columba then made the sign of the cross and said to the creature, "Go no further, do not touch the man, go back at once." And the creature reacted as if it had been magically repelled away from the man, which caused it to swim away. The locals apparently all clapped after witnessing the saint rid them of the dreaded creature, and the whole village clapped. There is an alternative version of the story where it was Columba himself who swam across the river, but it still ended in the same way of him using the Bible and God to scare the creature away. And this isn't the only story from over 1,000 years ago, however, since stone carvings were found which were again from Pictland and made by the Picts. Now, this carving in particular caused a lot of controversy because people are saying that it just looks like a horse. So maybe it could be a carving of a Kelpie or a carving of just a regular horse. The problem with that is the Picts pretty much mysteriously disappeared around 900 AD. They still lived in external settlements, but their big central settlements just mysteriously vanished. And almost all of these carvings are dated way before then. And horses were not properly introduced to Britain until the 1000s. But they were used in battles against the Picts by the Romans, and they did exist on the island after the Romans came here, but they weren't at all widespread. Britain did not really have wild horses, and most of them were all located down in England. Meaning, the Picts most likely would have never actually saw a horse or knew what one was by the time these were carved. So, how did they carve a horse? What actually is this then? Maybe it actually is a horse that the Picts just decided to carve after facing them in battle against the Romans. Maybe it's something else entirely. Unfortunately, we don't know, it's been lost to time. However, a lot of people are theorising that this is a carving of the Loch Ness Monster. The story of Nessie then returned to myth again until hundreds of years later, where in 1871, the Loch Ness Monster was apparently sighted again by D. Mackenzie of Balnain. He said that he saw something that looked like a very large log or a boat that had been overturned in the loch, until he noticed that it looked as though it was swimming. But before he could get closer to get a better look at it, the object disappeared into the depths. The next sighting was in 1888 by a stonemason named Alexander MacDonald from a break-in. He saw a large creature with stubby legs coming up from the loch and pushing itself forward across the ground close to where he was standing. He soon reported that he seen a large salamander-like creature entering the water to the loch, and he reported this to the water bailiff, a man who was named Alex Campbell. On the 2nd of May 1933, the story of the Loch Ness Monster flared up again, when the same Alex Campbell wrote an article in the Inverness Courier about a large creature he saw in the water that he referred to as the Beast, and he described it as a fish that was as big as a whale. It also included a sighting by Aldi Mackay, which was very similar to the same sighting as Alex, where Aldi and her husband allegedly saw the Loch Ness Monster as they were travelling by the loch side. They said that they saw it swimming for some time, but then shortly afterwards it plunged into the depths of the loch, creating waves large enough to be from a huge boat. On the 22nd of July of the very same year, a man named George Spicer and his wife saw a large animal crossing the newly built road towards the loch. They said that the body was only around 4 foot high, but the length of the creature was 25 feet long, and it had a long, narrow neck that stretched for 10 feet, and it had absolutely no limbs. They also said that they saw another animal in its huge mouth, which gives us the modern incarnation of what everyone thinks the Loch Ness Monster looks like. Though they described it as looking something similar to a dragon, but they never mentioned anything like, wings. But by the time they had gotten to the location where they saw Nessie, it was gone, and they assume it must have disappeared into the loch. The newly built road had actually become a big tourist destination for people who wanted to enjoy the sights of the loch, but also for people who had heard of sightings of this mysterious huge creature and they wanted to see it for themselves. Going in with a wild imagination would make people see Nessie everywhere they looked. A newspaper also posted an article which mentioned the sighting that George Spicer had witnessed, and that only encouraged more and more people to travel to the loch and cause an even further increase in more alleged sightings, especially during the time that the road was still being built, since the area was full of superstitious workmen on top of the tourists. It almost seems like the area was being developed, but unfortunately it wasn't doing, very well as far as travellers and stuff like that goes. So it almost seems like the rich people who were developing the area and wanted tourists and wanted travellers and, wanted commerce might have passed a couple of shillings to a couple of guys to make up a little bit of a story, and then they probably used their clout to get these stories printed in the local paper, and then they just let the housewives do the rest. I'm just saying, it kind of seems like that, but, that's none of my business. Actually, it is my business. I'm making a video on the fucking thing. In November of 1933, a man by the name of Hugh Gray claimed he had taken a photo of the creature, which in that era was quite a timely and expensive feat. The photo was extremely blurred, as they always seem to be when it comes to cryptids. It's really strange that, but that didn't stop the imaginations of the people that saw it, although there were some skeptics. Hugh had taken the photo while he was walking his Labrador by the loch side, so people would just suspect that it was the dog swimming in the water while carrying a big stick, but others would say that it was an otter or a swan. But they wouldn't know for sure until years later in 1963, when the original negatives for the photo were projected and it showed that it was just in fact a photo of an otter. The next year, on January the 5th, 1934, a man called Arthur Grant said he almost crashed his motorbike into a large creature while riding northeast of the loch. It was very dark at 1 a.m. in the morning, and Arthur described the creature as having a relatively small head attached to a very long neck, which matched the earlier description, which people perceived as giving his story validity. Arthur was a veterinary student, and he decided to draw what he saw. It was something that closely resembled a prehistoric plesiosaur. Just like earlier stories, Arthur said that by the time he stopped and calmed down to get a better look, all he saw were ripples in the loch surface because the creature had vanished. Since his sighting of Nessie was at night, some detractors claimed that it was just an otter he saw and he misjudged the size because it was so dark. Now, I know that we're talking about a mythological creature here, but I think someone would be able to know the size difference between what is basically a giant dinosaur and an otter. The next two photographs of Nessie are ones that you've probably seen, and they came from Robert Kenneth Wilson in 1934, who was a gynaecologist from London, though people refer to him as the surgeon, and the photos he took were named the surgeon's photographs, and these went on to become the most famous alleged photos of the Loch Ness Monster. However, they were ultimately confirmed to be a hoax because that's just me doing the backstroke, boys. The first photo is one of the most famous hoax pictures of Nessie that has been seen all across the world, but the second one hasn't been seen so much because it's too blurry. The story that Robert told was that he was looking across the water and he saw something with a small head and a long neck, and since he knew of the earlier description, he went, "Oh shit, that's Nessie," so he grabbed his camera and took some pictures. People believed for the longest time that this photo was clear evidence of Nessie's existence. But as always, some skeptics believed it was just an otter, a piece of wood, or even an elephant was one of the theories. Though later in 1993, the photo was proven to be another hoax, since when the image was examined, it appeared to actually be a toy submarine with a sculpture mounted on top of it. Over the years, there were many more sightings and hoaxes. In 1954, the crew of a fishing boat named Rival III noticed something very large on their sonar, and it wasn't a static object. It was actually following the boat from a depth of 479 feet below. Eventually, it left sonar range, and when they tried to re-establish a sonar visual, the object couldn't be found again. A year later, in 1955, yet another photo of what was thought to be Nessie was taken by Peter McNabb at Urquhart Castle, and it showed two humps in the water, though he did not release the photo for 2 years, where it was then used in a book. When examined, people said that it looked like it could just be the wake of boats travelling together, but other people just thought it was another hoax due to all of the other hoaxes that had come before. However, after the negatives for the picture were examined, it was revealed that the image had in fact been doctored. Hoaxes were being proven left, right and centre, which was starting to shake everyone's belief in the monster, even back then when people were a lot more superstitious. But a lot of people still thought they could find Nessie. In 1969, a submarine expert named Dan Taylor explored the depths of Loch Ness in a 20-foot long hand-built American submarine. I suppose you could call that a submarine. He made it to the bottom of the 744-foot deep loch, but he didn't find a shred of evidence of Nessie actually being down there. In 1975, a naturalist named Sir Peter Scott tried to have Nessie added to the British Register of Protected Wildlife, which meant he had to prove that the animal was an endangered species and that the species had a scientifically recognised name. The name that he chose for Nessie was Nessiteris rhombopteryx, which sounded legit until it was discovered by a Scottish politician named Nicholas Fairbairn that that name was actually an anagram of Monster Hoax by Sir Peter S. Which, come on, at least that one was funny. Another attempt to protect Nessie happened much later in 2001 because another Nessie hunter wanted to trawl Loch Ness with a net, take a sample of skin from Nessie for testing, and then release the creature back into the loch. Now, this one was much more grounded in reality because the real reason for the conservation attempt covered Nessie and all of the other animals of the loch, of which there were very, very many, including protecting the ecosystem. The guy basically wanted to preserve all of the wildlife of the area, but he used all of the Nessie hype as a way to drum up support for it. Which, yeah, alright, I'll give you that one, that's kind of clever. Another sighting which I want to cover actually happened in 1977, and this one is... This one's probably my favourite. We got one of the clearest ever photos of the Loch Ness Monster, and it was taken by a man called Anthony Shields, who was a magician and a psychic, so clearly someone worth listening to. And Anthony said that he